Katasha Edwards. I am a literacy PD specialist here at the department, and we're excited to have each of you here with us today. And just to go back, we had our Zoom meeting preparations to make sure that our phones and computers are muted and that our cameras are turned off. We always begin with our literacy division mission, that all students will have improved literacy outcomes through high quality instruction and interactions by an effective teacher supported by leaders and families. Our department priority is to provide the highest quality teaching and learning environment from birth through graduation. Here are our literacy pillars, and like we said in our previous sessions, these are our buckets. These are our actions that we're going to look at to support effective literacy instruction throughout our series and throughout our literacy implementation within our schools and within our state. Here's a quick recap from session 3. And all of our sessions are available in the literacy library. During the last Leaders series session, we took a pulse check and we looked at where we were and where we wanted to go with literacy implementation. We challenged each of our participants to evaluate their current literacy processes and then to determine quick wins. So I'm really interested to see what quick wins our leaders have come up with, and maybe we'll revisit that in a subsequent session. Today's session focus, however, will be on the components of literacy learning communities. We'll look at some structures and protocols. We'll look at some adult core competencies, data management and tracking, and assessment awareness. And we're going to look at how all of these different components can work together to support literacy-based instruction. So we'll start here with defining a literacy community, a learning community. And I think a good place to pause is that depending on where you are in your journey as a leader, I'm sure that you've spent time working with professional learning communities within your school or within your district. So depending on where you are, they can look different. So for the purpose of today, we're going to define a learning community as a group of educators who regularly engage with colleagues. They share expertise, they analyze student work, plan instruction, reflect on their own practices, and collaborate to improve their personal skills, all with the focus on student proficiency and student learning. So I think the most important key is that there is that shared collective collaboration with student achievement and student learning at the heart. So let's look at learning community structures. And before we go on, I know that we could spend this entire day beyond the time that we have allotted to talk about learning communities. So today is going to be a snapshot of learning communities with a lens or perspective from a literacy mindset. When setting up your learning communities to include a literacy focus, you should identify your community space. And the great thing, or one of the things that came out of the pandemic, is that we know that our learning communities, we can meet them face to face, or they could also be virtual, within your school or even across schools. So there are many options when scheduling and setting up that space for your learning communities. Some persons that you probably want to include are your classroom teachers, of course, your master and lead teachers, any curriculum specialists, if you have literacy coaches, instructional coaches, your school admin team, and your speech and language pathologists, especially when thinking about language acquisition and language development. So what are the structures of a learning community? At the heart of your learning community, there should be that collective inquiry. There should be a focus on collecting and assessing data with student learning at the focus, at the heart of that, collaboration. There should be some clear parameters for adult actions and for student actions. Some professional ownership over instructional practices, proactive open-ended questions, your success criteria for collecting your data, what kind of rubrics are you using? And there should be a shared understanding of research, curriculum, lesson delivery, and building a team of collective intelligence. So I'm very visual. I'm a very visual learner. So when going through preparing for this presentation, I really, did some research and looking at some different infographics that support learning communities. And I found this infographic that I kind of adapted. And I linked in the presentation for your resource that you can go back to the original source from where it was adapted. It was adapted from using inquiry cycles to improve literacy instruction. But I really liked the way this looks, because you see when starting that cycle of inquiry, that is like the launching point of your learning community. And here, you're going to reflect on that current practice. You're going to choose some instructional area that you want to focus on, that you want to develop, and you're going to plan a data collection strategy. And that teacher goes back into her classroom to collect the data. And it's important that we're collecting both quantitative and qualitative data, that it's not all our formative assessments, but that we're looking at anecdotal notes, teacher observation, and any other forms of data that are going to support this learning inquiry process. And once that data is collected, you see here that the learning community is going to work together to analyze and discuss that data to better understand what's going on. They're going to identify where they are, where there are gaps, and where they want to go. And then they're going to strategically develop some research-based practices to test in the classroom. And I think that's important to highlight, especially with literacy instruction. When we look at our data within our learning communities, we're going to use some research-based best practices to support going in to make a change. So that teacher takes those strategies and they head back into the classroom, and they're going to collect some more data and bring that back to our learning community to analyze and discuss this new data. Some of the questions that they might ask is, what did we learn from the data? Did the change work? Should we adapt, or should we abandon the change? And this cycle continues until the goal is met. And another thing that's important to highlight is, especially within our learning communities, our literacy teachers may be self-contained teachers where they're launching the inquiry process with a literacy strategy, and they may be launching it with a math strategy, and they may be launching it with something else. So within our learning communities, we're forever in these cycles until the goal is met, and knowing that we can continue to launch a new inquiry process at any time. So I thought that was a helpful graphic. So within our learning communities, we know that there are 4 guiding questions. And if you've done the PLC at work or any of the solution tree, the 4 defines those 4 guiding questions that you're going to utilize within your learning communities. And so we know that we want to start with, what do we want our students to know? But then we want to think about what are those actions that help us to figure out what we want our students to know. We know that we need clear objectives and learning targets. We need to develop essential questions to guide the lesson planning and delivery. And we're going to think about, how are the adults going to provide this experience for learning? Now, the second question is, how will we know if they learn? And this is important for us to create these criteria for learning prior to giving the instruction, so that learning community is going to work together to establish those criteria. And then we know that our teacher is going to give multiple opportunities for students to gain that understanding. And then we're going to have a clearly defined way for them to demonstrate their understanding before we even begin the instruction. So our third question is, what will we do when students haven't learned? And we know that this is our reteaching and reassessing process where we go back in and we're going to reteach and we're going to use some different strategies and we're going to do some reflecting. And the last question is, what will we do when students have already learned it? So we're going to provide some opportunities, to move explicit instruction to a deeper level. And here it recommends that, you're looking at that reading rope and looking at a deeper level of where to provide some support for those students who already mastered. So a way to do some acceleration. So let's think about what are those adult core competencies aligned to literacy learning that we want all adults to know, understand, and use within our learning communities. We want adults to know how to use student work to assess strengths and weaknesses in their students' performance, how to use observation and assessments related back to the science of reading conceptual models. We want adults to understand the big ideas of the science of reading and those conceptual models of the simple view of reading, Scarborough's reading rope, Erie's phases of word development. If you're working with teachers of students that are even in middle school, it would be important for them to understand how students learn to read and understanding those strands within that reading rope. And we want our adults to use academic language and specific vocabulary when referencing the components of literacy instruction. So here are a few resources that I was able to kind of pull together to support you on your literacy community journey. So thinking about, a toolkit, what will your teachers need? What will your team need when planning for literacy learning and literacy instruction? You want to make sure that we have copies of our grade level standards and we can have those digitally. Any teacher manuals, our pacing guides, our scope and sequences, any student data. A lot of school systems utilize data binders, student data binders, where your teachers come equipped with some data around their students. So as we're developing that inquiry cycle, that we have data to look at. We definitely want to have established norms, and we want to have effective strategies based on the science of reading that can be utilized within our learning communities. This is just a sample agenda that can be utilized to support your learning community. And if I would highlight one thing from this agenda, is that whenever we leave our learning communities, we should always determine our goals and our next steps and have a plan for our follow-up meeting. So, once we come into our literacy learning community and we present the data and we look at and come up with those strategies, we should always have a clearly defined plan of action when we leave those meetings. Let's talk a little bit about assessment. And I think we already hinted to a little bit earlier is that, our assessment results of our students should guide what's going on. It should drive the instruction. All of our assessments should be very intentional. We should move, if you haven't already, we should definitely move away. It's Friday and it's the weekly test and I just need a grade. We need to be very intentional when creating assessments for our students. And then we should be able to use that information to move students forward. Here are some different types of assessments. We have our summative assessments, formative assessments, our screeners, diagnostics, curriculum-based measures, and common formative assessments are all types of assessments. So here's some questions. We're not going to read all these questions. You can go back and look at those at a later time. But I thought that it was important for us to have guiding questions when creating assessments. Definitely making sure that we're intentional and purposeful when creating assessments. And that we're using our students' understandings and misunderstandings to make sure that we make changes in our practice so that we can ensure student mastery of skills. So the next area that we want to look at is that we have clearly defined data management and tracking so that we can ensure that all students learn. Within our processes, data collection is defined as the procedure that we're going to collect and we're going to measure and analyze information in order to make informed decisions about our instruction and about student mastery. And here you see that same list of different types of assessments. Those are things that we can utilize to collect data to ensure that we're moving students forward. Here are some data management and analysis procedures. We should have established protocols and procedures to collect and chart data. And this should be done prior to our PLC meetings. And we should analyze student strengths and misunderstandings. We could use student work samples, teacher anecdotal notes. We could look for trends within grade bands, levels, and classes. And based on this data, we should always be creating goals. What is it that we want to accomplish? We should always select instructional strategies that are backed in the science of reading. We should create student mastery learning criteria, and we talked about that. This should be done prior to giving instructions. What are our common scoring guides? How will the students be assessed? And then we look at our adult behaviors or actions related to data tracking and monitoring, and we should always progress monitor. We should never just use our summative assessment or our common formative assessment as the only way to check for understanding. We should know that within our PLCs and within our instruction that we're constantly progress monitoring and that we're checking for understanding. So now we're going to pause a little bit and we're going to look at our literacy learning communities, with a literacy mindset. Now, for the past few sessions, we've done a spotlight on the science of reading, and we looked at those word recognition strands that a lot of our kindergarten, first grade, even second grade teachers spend a lot of time helping our students to develop. And we're gonna look at teacher A. Teacher A is a teacher who's been working within those word recognition strands, and she's been working on some decoding skills with a small group of students. And if you attended Sarah's session on phonics, maybe about a week and a half ago, she introduced you to a student who had been working on the sound of E at the end of a word. So here's teacher A. She's been working with those 4 students in a small group, and she knows that her students need a lot of repetition and a lot of practice, but she's worked with her grade level team, and she's going to give a running record to check her students' progress with mastering that skill of that E at the end of the word. She's collected some data from her small group, and she's going to bring that data to her learning community. So here's some student work analysis. If you attended Sarah's session, you met the student already. This is student 1. And we can look here and analyze student 1's running record of this very short passage of where teacher A really wants to see where her small group is going with being able to read those words or decode those words with the E at the end. So we can see here that student 1 had 5 errors when reading, and all of the errors that student 1 made were with that E at the end of the word. So let's meet student 2. Here's that same running record because she's been working with this same group of 4 students within that small group. And we see here that student 2 didn't make any errors. So let's look at student 3. And we're gonna look at student 3 in terms of looking at the E at the end of the word and if they were able to give that long vowel sound. And we see here that this student was not consistent with their errors. This student incorrectly read 3 of the words with the E at the end, and they correctly read 2 of the words with the E at the end. And you even see here where they self-corrected which wasn't counted as an error, a short vowel word. Now here's that final student within that small group. And we see here that student 4 didn't make any errors. So teacher A has taken some time. She's given this running record to all 4 of her students, and she's assembled her data into a little graph, and she's charted it. And she's just made a note that student 1, 2, 3, and 4, the number of errors that they made, and then kind of what were the misconceptions that she was able to see within her small group with those errors. And you can see here that student number 1 and number 4 both made errors with that target skill that she was working on. And that student 2 and student 4 didn't make any, there weren't any noted misconceptions because they didn't make any errors on that running record. So teacher A has compiled she's done a running record, she's compiled her data, and she's begun to reflect on those questions, and she's brought them to the literacy learning community. And we know that what she wanted her students to know was that she was working on that foundational skills standard of knowing the final E at the end of the word. And how was she going to know if they learned it? Because prior to doing that instruction, she knew that she was going to give a running record to give a formative assessment of their progress. And then, what will she do when students haven't learned? Well, she knows that, and we're working with her group, that students 1 and 3 will need some explicit reteaching on that skill. And then what will she do when students have already learned it? She knows that student 2 and student 4 could benefit from some extension activity. So just looking back at our cycle, we see here where she launched that inquiry process. She collected her data. She took the data to the literacy learning community and they analyzed it. So from this point, how could her learning community support her with these 4 students in this small group? They're going to help her identify those specific strategies to support student 1 and student 3 with mastery of that foundational standard of that final E at the end of the word. She's going to identify some extension and opportunities for 2 and 4. They're going to work together and collaboratively come up with those extension opportunities. And then she's going to head back into her classroom and they're going to test those strategies and collect additional data. She's going to collect that additional data and analyze it in order to make decisions about next steps, because she's going to bring that back to that learning community. And, based on that cycle, this cycle could continue until the goal is met with this group of students or with any group of students. So let's pause a few minutes and let's think about our reflection questions for today. How are learning communities currently structured in your school or district? And I know we used a very simple example of the running record, but just think about if you're a middle school teacher and you were teaching voice and you had your student writing that you brought to your learning community, and you were able to sit down with that rubric and assess those students' ability to use that skill. And you were able to bring that to your learning community and help come up with strategies to support students with being able to use voice in their writing. So we could use that literacy learning cycle or that inquiry cycle to support students at any level. So think about how you're using learning communities. How are they structured? What does your common planning time look like? What are your expectations for learning communities within your school system or your district? What resources are used to ensure collaboration around student achievement? Is there a PLC recording sheet? Do you have resources in place to support your teachers' collaboration around student achievement? Do you have those data collection charts and graphs that you're utilizing to support teachers with analyzing their data. And then let's think about, how do you plan to utilize learning communities to support effective literacy implementation practices? So we've looked at what these literacy learning communities look like. We've looked at how they should or can be structured. So now at this point, I want you to think about how you're going to use your learning communities to ensure that you're utilizing effective literacy practice within your school or district. So before we go on, we're going to pause one more time and just look back at that cycle, just to make sure that when you're doing your reflections, what does the cycle look like within your schools? How are your teachers organized? Are they organized in departmentalized groups? Or are they organized in, or do they teach everything? Are you looking at all kinds of data every week? Or is there a cycle that you're on, a bi-weekly cycle where you're looking at your math data one week and you're looking at your literacy data? So there are so many decisions for you to make, but the important thing is for there to be an established structure for you to utilize to support your learning communities within your school. So before we end today, I want to make sure that you utilize our session feedback form, and just knowing that we really just scratched the surface with our literacy learning communities. And this is definitely like something that we want to go back and revisit moving forward. And beginning this week, we're going to have office hours scheduled for literacy and for the science of reading. So, you may want to jump on the office hours to talk a little bit about your PLCs or your literacy learning communities and how you have them structured. As usual, if you have any questions, you can always email me, or any suggestions at katasha.edwards@la.gov. Or you can email louisianaliteracy@la.gov. I want to thank you for attending today's session. And I want to let you know that the department appreciates your literacy leadership as always. So be sure to take a few minutes to do the session feedback and have a fantastic Monday.